Chapter 6. The two Ronin were in time to join the last of the dinner guests assembled and waiting to file into the dining hall. They were surprised to learn that they would be dining with the envoy and some of his men. It was an unexpected honor for the two Ronin. Zenta was usually very careless of his appearance, and Matsuzo was relieved that for this occasion he had taken the trouble to look almost presentable. The two men were wearing the kimonos brought by the little maid, and as Matsuzo settled the sleeves of his, he could still smell the faint perfume of the storehouse incense. At first glance, Matsuzo found the huge dining hall rather austere. The wooden floor was bare and polished to a mirror smoothness. Seating for the guests consisted of flat round cushions of braided rice straw, but Matsuzo soon detected signs of elegance. The tall candlesticks were of beautifully chased bronze, and one wall of the room was almost completely covered by a painting of a pine tree. The picture dominated the room with its vivid green and gold. Matsuzo knew enough about art to tell that the painting was the work of a master. He suspected the influence of Lord Okudaida's second wife in the furnishings. A lady from the capital city, used to elegance and sophistication, would want to soften the austerity of a feudal lord's castle. The diners sat down along three sides of the room, with the daimyo's envoy at the place of honor in front of the painting. By the somber richness of his kimono, the envoy made the chamberlain's bright colors look cheap. Even for this social occasion, the envoy's face did not relax from its rigid hauteur. 3 of his retainers were at the dinner, and they behaved with equal aloofness. An individual tray of food was set on the floor in front of each diner, and the first course began. Servants scurried around, diligently filling sake cups, but in spite of their efforts, the party showed no signs of becoming a success. Looking over the dinner guests, Matsuzo thought that they formed a rather ill-assorted company. He glanced from the aristocratic envoy to the fawning chamberlain, who was seated next to the guest of honor. Below him was Jihei, holding a ridiculously delicate china wine cup in his huge, powerful hands. Sitting beside Jihei was the envoy's chief retainer, a samurai called Saemon. Matsuzo remembered him as the man who had spoken to the chamberlain in the courtyard that afternoon. Saemon had a pleasant-faced, clever-looking and humorous. Although not powerfully built like Jihei, he gave the impression of wiry strength. For some reason, Matsuzo suspected that Saemon was more intelligent than his master the envoy. Perhaps it was the way the envoy frequently looked at his retainer, as if for guidance. Matsuzo's eyes finally went back to Zenta, who was hunched over his tray wholly occupied with food. In fact, his concentration on food was almost embarrassing to see. Meanwhile, the chamberlain was struggling to make pleasant conversation with his unresponsive guest of honor. "Did you have good weather on your way up? It can get quite blustery at this time of year." "I didn't notice the weather, since I was traveling on an important mission," answered the envoy coldly. It was heavy going, but the chamberlain was not easily discouraged. "I used to make the trip to the daimyo's capital quite often when I was a youth. In recent years, of course, my duties at the castle have prevented me from traveling, but I still remember one particularly bad river that had to be forded. Do you know the one I mean?" "An account of your youthful adventures is no doubt of overwhelming interest to some of the people in this room," said the envoy, openly yawning. The chamberlain flushed. Turning to scowl at the serving girl holding the wine jar behind him, he said, "Stop dawdling and hurry up with that sake! Who is responsible for your training, anyway?" "Since the girl was probably trained in Lord Okudaida's household," said the envoy, acidly, "perhaps it's a good thing that your master is not alive to hear your criticism." That silenced the chamberlain, and for the next few minutes conversation in the dining hall languished. Then the chamberlain emptied 3 cups of sake in rapid succession and picked up the courage to try again. He launched into a description of the castle, and he finally seemed to have found a topic that interested his guests. Matsuzo saw that Saemon's eyes were bright with interest as he listened to the chamberlain's talk of the castle's fortification, and even the envoy's sneer was less pronounced. Only Zenta, busily eating, paid no attention. "And by the time the stone base for the outer wall was completed," said the chamberlain, "our castle became one of the most strongly fortified in this part of the country." He turned to Zenta. "You have traveled widely, I'm told, and you must have seen a great deal. What do you think of it?" "What?" Zenta's reply was muffled. He hurriedly swallowed some fish and held out his wine cup to the waiting servant. "I think that serving it raw with chopped herbs and soy sauce is an excellent way of preparing this fish, but I also like it rubbed with coarse salt and broiled." He seemed not to notice the smiles that greeted his remark, and he added, "By the way, it seems ungrateful to mention this after receiving all this lavish hospitality, but when I was taking a bath this evening, I felt something icy crawl down my neck. It was a most peculiar sensation. Perhaps you should have the bathrooms here checked for pests." In the silence that followed, Matsuzo heard a faint plop. A piece of raw fish had fallen from the chamberlain's nervous hand into his wine cup. The envoy was the first to speak. "Since I arrived at this castle, there have been disturbances in the night. My retainer Saemon made inquiries, and he told me that people here claimed the disturbances were caused by something called the White Serpent." Jihei broke in. "That's just pure feminine hysteria." "You mean that I was suffering from feminine hysteria?" asked Zenta gently. "Of course I didn't mean you." said Jihei impatiently. "I was referring to those women who said they saw a long white thing and heard ghostly music." "Some of the samurai here say that they have heard the ghostly music too," said Simon. "One of the women could be deliberately playing a trick on us," growled Jihei. "But if it's just a woman's trick, why can't you find out how she did it and stop her?" asked Zenta. "It's not as easy as you think," said Jihei angrily. "Most of the disturbances took place in the women's quarters, and we're not supposed to go there. But the next time there is an outcry about the ghost, I promise that we will make a very thorough search into every corner of the castle, even if it does take us into the women's quarters." "Are you saying that some woman in this castle is pretending to be the ghost?" asked the envoy. "What can be her reason for doing this?" The chamberlain said hurriedly, "Jihei only means that he is a realist, and is not ready to believe in anything without solid proof." Turning to Jihei, he said, "But by its very nature, it's impossible to get solid proof of a ghost. These old legends are never complete without foundation, you know. We shouldn't defend the spirits by too much skepticism. Nevertheless, we should search carefully for traces of human handiwork behind the ghost," insisted Jihei. As the trays for the first course were removed and the second course brought in, a serving woman came in, bowed, and spoke to the chamberlain in a low voice. The chamberlain gave a start of surprise and smiled happily. "We are indeed fortunate tonight," he announced. "Lady Kaede wishes to honor our distinguished guests, and she is having some of the castle's prized sake brought out to be served." A double sliding door opened, and Lady Kaede, Lord Okudaida's widow, entered the room. She was followed by a procession of serving girls holding trays with heated bottles of sake. Lady Kaede looked so young that Matsuzo found it hard to believe she had a 9-year-old son. He remembered Ume saying that Lady Kaede was from one of the noble families of Miyako, and he could imagine the generations of inbreeding that went into producing her fine bones. Transplanted from the milder Miyako air, she looked almost too frail to support the harsh northern climate. With a bow to the guest of honor, she said, "This wine is of poor quality, but it is the best that we have in this backward region. Therefore, please accept it as a mark of our respect." She spoke with a marked Western accent that sounded soft and musical compared to the staccato speech of the northern warriors. Acknowledging the envoy's thanks, she retreated outside the square of diners and sat down to direct her women in serving the wine. Matsuzo suspected that curiosity about the guests had prompted her appearance at the party, for she looked at the envoy and his retainer Saemon with keen interest. He even found her thoughtful gaze on himself and Zenta. Without joining the conversation of the diners, she examined in turn each of the visitors to the castle. Conversation in the room was losing its struggle for survival. The usual coarse jests heard in a drinking party did not flourish in the envoy's hearing, and with Lady Kaeda's added presence, even milder attempts at humor died down. The chamberlain began to look desperate as the stretches of silence grew longer and longer. Made bold by the sake, he finally turned to the envoy and said, "Have you attended many drinking parties at the daimyo's castle together with Lord Okudaira?" "No," replied the envoy curtly. "I have had very few opportunities to do so." At this point, Zenta looked up from his food at last. With the worst of his hunger pangs satisfied, he seemed ready to make some much-needed contribution to the conversation. He addressed the envoy respectfully. "Perhaps you were present on the famous occasion when Lord Okudaira and his friend Lord Mochizuki spent the whole evening capping each other's verses to a beautiful lady. Their poetic feats were the talk of the daimyo's capital for weeks." The envoy's expression grew freezing. "I hardly think that Lord Okudaira's love affair is the proper topic for discussion in the present company." Zenta's chopsticks fell from his fingers with a clatter. He sat completely still for several seconds, and then he roused himself and put his chopsticks on their china holder with exaggerated care. Matsuzo went hot with shame over the public rebuke received by his friend, and for a moment he was filled with an acute dislike for the arrogant envoy. He looked at Lady Kaede for her reaction, and saw that she sat as motionless as a porcelain doll. Her face showed not a trace of expression. During the next few minutes, Zenta busied himself with his food once more. Suddenly he raised his head and addressed the envoy again, evidently willing to risk another rebuke. "Were you at the archery contest in the daimyo's capital last May? All of the daimyo's chief supporters must have taken part. What a glorious pageant it was. It was a pity that the weather was so wet. The muddy ground caused many horses to slip, and several fine archers lost through no fault of theirs." The envoy seemed to regret his harshness toward the Ronin, and this time he answered more pleasantly. "I had to miss that contest, unfortunately. The wet weather started a recurrence of an old illness of mine." He looked at Zenta in some surprise. "Were you there during the contest?" "I was there in the capacity of an attendant," replied Zenta. "Some of the contestants wanted a little coaching." There was a bustling in the dining hall. Lady Kaede had stood up, and she was directing her women to gather up the sake utensils. Cutting short the chamberlain's effusive thanks, she gave a grave nod to the company. Then she arranged her trailing skirt behind her and swept from the room. With Lady Kaeda's departure, the envoy apparently felt that the dinner party had no further claim on his patience. In spite of the chamberlain's eager offer to call in dancers and musicians, he could not be persuaded to stay any longer. "I know what we shall do," said the chamberlain. "We can take a stroll in the garden to dispel the wine fumes. It would be nice to do some moon viewing, and the more talented of us can make verses." When the envoy showed no interest in verse-making, the chamberlain said, hurriedly, "Our garden is noted for its miniature mountain, a most curiously shaped piece of rockery. We should be honored to have your opinion on it." While the chamberlain gave orders for lanterns to be brought, the dinner guests struggled to their feet. There were some audible groans and some crackling knees. The diners left the room as quickly as good manners permitted, glad to escape the discomfort of the dinner party and find release in the garden.